I had heard a knock on the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. I looked around, nothing. Then I looked down and saw it. Lying there on the doorstep was an old cell phone with a cracked screen. I picked it up and clicked the home button. It opened without a passcode, revealing a home screen with only one app. "Rebecca?" I called out to my 18-year-old daughter as I stepped back inside and closed the door behind me. "You know anything about the cell phone I just found on the doorstep?" "On the doorstep?" She called back from the living room, likely scrolling away on her own phone. "Yeah, with a big crack in it?" "Nope. I guess I'll just throw it out then." "Wait, I want to see!" she cried out, her curiosity piqued as she made her way over to the kitchen. I held it up for her to see. "Ew, looks old, like from when you and Mom were growing up. When your mom and I were growing up, there were no cell phones, Becca." "Sounds boring." "Yeah, it was. Perfectly boring, in the best way possible. Now look at what's become of the world." Yeah, let me see it," she said, snatching the old cracked cell phone out my hand. "What's the passcode?" "There isn't one." She opened it. "Just one app. This phone is so mid." "Mid?" I asked, unfamiliar with her Gen Z slang. "It means like mediocre, Dad. Where'd you find this thing anyway?" "I told you on the doorstep. Someone knocked and ran away." "So it's some sort of prank?" "If it is, it's a pretty mid prank," I replied, giving her the same smug look I always did when I landed a dad joke. "Ew, your jokes are not funny, Dad. Anyways, I'm gonna see what's in the app," Rebecca said as she scurried off back to the living room and proceeded to scroll away on the cracked old phone. "Cool. Let me know what you find, Becca," I said casually as I sat back down at the dinner table and continued reading my newspaper. An hour or so later, my wife Erica returned home from work and we had dinner. "Rebecca, it's dinner time," Erica called out from the kitchen. But my daughter didn't reply. "Becca?" I added. But again, Rebecca ignored us. My wife and I both looked at each other and rolled our eyes. "Your loss. Food'll be cold again," Erica said, referring to the countless other times our social media-obsessed teen had forgone dinner so long that the meal had become cold. "Kids," I muttered under my breath. "So how was work, honey?" A few hours later, my wife and I decided to go upstairs for the night, and seeing that Rebecca was still scrolling away on the couch, reminded her that her dinner was on the table. Once again, our daughter just ignored us as she continued to scroll away on her phone. Something that, after raising an 18-year-old daughter, I was very used to. But this time, something was different. This time, she was scrolling on a different phone. The old cracked phone I had found on the doorstep, to be precise. "She's still using that old thing? Wonder what app was on there? Must be some game or social media thing." I thought to myself, "Just remember to turn the lights out before you go to bed, Becca." My wife called down, before we retired to our bedroom, to no reply. But the next morning, not only did we find the lights on, but we also found Rebecca still sitting there. Sure enough, scrolling away on the old cracked phone. "Rebecca," my wife called out, "did you even sleep last night?" "Yeah, Becca, you really shouldn't be pulling all-nighters like that," I added as I went to the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee. But before I could make it that far, something caught my eye on the kitchen table. To my disbelief, there was Rebecca's dinner, still sitting there, completely untouched. That's when I knew that something was very wrong. By the time my wife and I were able to pry the old cracked cell phone out of our daughter's hands, Rebecca had gone into a sudden fit of rage. "Give it back!" she screamed, her eyes cold and lifeless. I tossed the phone to Erica behind me while I stood between her and our daughter. "I said, give it back!" Rebecca screamed again in a threatening fashion. "Becca, what's gotten into you? It's just an old phone, and a cracked one at that," I began. But before I could continue, my innocent daughter, who had never laid a finger on a soul her entire life, suddenly lunged at me, swung her arm, and ran her nails across my face, tearing the flesh from my skin and causing blood to pour down my neck. "Rebecca!" I yelled, raising my voice. But it was too late. She had already hopped over me and chased my wife into the kitchen. When I finally caught up to her at the entrance to the kitchen, I saw my daughter standing there with a steak knife on one side of the kitchen table, while my wife stood on the other, shaking in fear, as she held the old cracked phone in her hand. "What was on that app?" I asked hypothetically out loud, realizing that whatever my daughter had discovered on the phone must have been the cause of her 14-hour doom scroll and subsequent fit of rage. But Erica must have taken me literally, immediately opening the phone and going to the app. I saw a perplexed look wash over my wife's face as she took her finger, placed it on the phone's cracked surface, and started to scroll. "No! Erica, stop!" I cried out as I ran over to her and ripped the phone from her hand. But before I could even process what had happened, I heard the steak knife that my daughter was holding fall to the kitchen floor before she too collapsed to the ground. "Becca?" I asked, confused by her sudden change of disposition, but at the same time, relieved that her fit of rage had ceased. That's when I heard a growl behind me, as my daughter's rage had somehow shifted to my wife, and Erica picked up the knife from the floor. "Give it back!" My wife screamed, her eyes now cold and lifeless. I looked down at my daughter, who looked as if she had just awoken from a trance. That's when I realized that whatever curse had been bestowed upon the old cracked phone's app seemed to only affect the last person who used it. I took my dazed daughter by the hand and led her out of the kitchen, out of the house, and to the driveway, as my wife followed, still wielding the knife. "Get in!" I insisted, as I opened my car door and Rebecca hopped inside before I used my key fob to lock her inside. "Give me the phone!" My wife cried from behind me as she swung the knife at me. I stepped aside and watched its blade pierce the hood of my car. I thought to call out my wife's name in an attempt to snap her out of it, but immediately realizing that there was only one way to snap her out of her trance. As she struggled to pull the blade out of the car, I seized the opportunity to run back in the house and turn on the sink in the first-floor bathroom. Eventually, my wife came back inside looking for me, and sure enough, headed for the source of the running water. And when she stepped inside, I hopped out from behind the kitchen island, slamming the door behind her, before dragging a nearby bookshelf against the door and reinforcing it with a few other heavy objects. "Give me the phone!" I heard her cry out from inside the bathroom as I looked at the old cracked cell phone that I was still gripping in my hand and knew what I had to do. 30 minutes later, the deed was done. The old cracked cell phone, left on a random neighbor's doorstep in the next town over, where I hoped no one would recognize me. When I got back to the car, my daughter was just sitting there in the passenger seat, still traumatized and speechless from what she had just gone through. We drove home in silence, and when we finally got back, we waited by the barricaded bathroom door as my wife continued to scream and waited, until eventually she stopped. I slid the heavy objects and bookshelf aside and opened the bathroom door, to find Erica just standing there as if waking from a bad dream, the same exhausted expression on her face that I'd seen previously on my daughter. It had worked. My wife was no longer possessed by the vile device. Erica walked over and hugged me. I looked over at my daughter. She smiled. I smiled back. In that moment, two things became clear. One, someone else had been possessed by the phone prior to leaving it on my doorstep. Two, someone new was possessed by it now. But all that mattered to me in that moment was that my family was okay. I wish I could say that after the dust settled, my daughter swore off cell phones, social media, and apps altogether. But the truth is, it only took a day before she was back to doom scrolling on her own phone. Now every time she does, and her dinner gets cold, I can't help but fear that she's been possessed again. But then I realize she's just a teenager. There was no bio on Ruth's profile, only pictures, and within a handful of messages she'd asked me over to her place. Straight out of the gate, that was 2 red flags, but she swore she wasn't a catfish, so I suggested we grab a cheeky pint first. That way, if a hairy biker dude turned up and made kissy faces at me, I could make a speedy getaway through the fire exit. Ruth looked like a Greek goddess in her thigh-high skirt and trench coat. She had these stunning onyx eyes and almost seemed to glow in the dinky little pub. Every time she tossed her hair, the other drinkers stole glances in the back bar mirror. She looked different from the photos, sure, but still leagues above me. I went for a hug, which she redirected into a firm handshake. Ruth wore thick winter gloves even though the fireplace in the corner was roaring. As I caught a trace of her scent, fresh and lovely, a sensible voice at the back of my mind screamed, "What's the catch?" Surely any second now she'd trick me into emptying my bank account. Crap, maybe she'd already swiped my credit card? I patted my pockets. Wallet, phone, Pokemon keychain. Nope, all there. Already the marshal waving that third red flag was a speck in the rearview mirror. The bartender took our orders. I asked for a pint of Guinness, whereas Ruth stuck with tap water. Then we eased into a conversation about our lives. When I started telling her about life in the IT game, she yawned sarcastically. Chuckling, I said, "Well, what do you do then?" "Between what and what?" "Between surgeon and anything that doesn't involve bodily fluids." "Huh. I thought they might have warned you about those in medical school." I didn't always have a problem with them. There was a traumatizing experience. She shuddered as if reliving a painful memory. "Anyway, let's talk about your sex life." Caught off guard, I spat a mouthful of Guinness all over the counter. An agitated Ruth grabbed a wet wipe from her pocket, cleared the mess, and then readjusted the placemats and ashtray so everything aligned perfectly. The ginger bartender side-eyed her but said nothing. The beautiful brunette told me she had a bunch of kinks, and I'd be lying if I told you my heart didn't flutter a little. She asked whether I was ready for another drink. I was, although I took small, steady sips because I never could handle my alcohol. Any more than 4 pints usually resulted in me clinging onto the toilet bowl like a life raft. Finally, I just came out with what was nagging at me. "Ruth, don't take this the wrong way, but are you real? Like, what's the catch here? Am I gonna wake up tomorrow missing a kidney?" That made her chuckle. "I'll be honest, there is a catch. I'll tell you if you promise not to make fun of me." I crossed my heart. She leaned close, pushed her pouty lips right up against my ear, and said, "I'm a clean freak. Like a major clean freak. If you come back to my place tonight, I need you to wash yourself the second we get there." As her gloved finger ran along my shirt collar, she fought the urge to retch. "Those clothes will need cleaned too. I've got a fresh pair you can borrow. And you must brush your teeth. Also, have you got an earwax remover with you? If not, you can borrow one from my emergency kit." I asked whether she was serious. "Deadly. I absolutely cannot stand filth. I need you, spotless. Sound good?" A winning lottery ticket had blown into my hand. I finished my pint in one long gulp, wiped away my foam mustache, and said, "Sounds great." In the front seat of her Volvo, Ruth handed me a breath mint. Probably because a trace of my aunt's famous cottage pie lingered on my breath. She drove west out of town, toward an ultra-modern house, standing against the forest. The straight angles of the white building looked odd, juxtaposed against the pine trees, and there was an angular barrier around back, keeping the vermin at bay. The sterile stench of disinfectant stung my nostrils the second we stepped through the front door. Everything was meticulously organized, all straight lines and spotless, like something from an IKEA catalog. You could have performed open-heart surgery in any room. There wasn't a single piece of furniture not covered in plastic, and 2 stuffed kittens batting invisible string stood guard in the downstairs landing. "Aren't they cute?" Ruth asked when she noticed me staring. It's like she occupied an alternative shrink-wrapped universe. She made me kick off my shoes, then I followed her to the end of the hall. Standing in the middle of the bathroom, she watched as I stripped off. Her neutral expression stung. She grabbed my clothes into a Ziploc bag, which she held away from herself like radioactive waste, and then she provided clear instructions about which soap and shampoo I needed to use. I bit down on the temptation to tell her I'd been washing myself for years. The sarcasm is probably what kept me single for so long, and stepped into the shower. Ruth left a white linen shirt and a pair of jeans folded neatly over the towel rack. The earwax remover on the edge of the sink operated like something out of Star Trek. I figured out the settings eventually, though. In the lounge, she handed me a shot of something fruity and sour. We clinked glasses and drank. The liquid burned on the way down. I went to sit on the sofa, but the plastic made it slicker than a water slide. I fell to the ground, and before I could pick myself up, my head got heavy and the air became stale. What happened next is a blur. 1 minute the ground was shifting beneath my feet. Next, I'm flat on my back. My legs were stuck. Alcohol was sloshing around the pit of my stomach. and breathing was borderline impossible. I made myself look down, a surprisingly difficult process. Past the end of the bed, Ruth rose into view, a mean-spirited grin on her face. She was encasing my legs with shrink wrap like an Egyptian mummy, gradually working her way north. I opened my mouth. No words came out. "Shh! This won't take long," she said. She swung her leg over my midsection, straddling me. Then she leaned forward and pushed her lips against my ear. "Don't worry, I'm going to take care of you. You look so handsome, all lovely and spotless. I'm just making sure you stay that way, forever." Her tongue probed the inside of my ear, and then she went to fetch medical equipment from the corner of the room. My brain couldn't piece the mess together, but I knew I needed to get out of there, fast. I tried flexing my leg muscles, but lacked the strength. Ruth's arms clamped tight around my ankles. "Stop, you're messing everything up." With all the energy I could summon, I thrashed from side to side until I fell off the bed. The wooden floor hit worse than concrete. I opened my mouth to groan, but instead a great flood of vomit shot out as if launched by a supercharged sprinkler. Chunks of cottage pie flew in every direction, a fountain of half-digested beef mince, onions, carrots, and garlic. Ruth rushed over to restrain me, but I rolled away, and as I did, her shoes skidded through the rancid contents of my stomach, and she fell. The germaphobe popped right back up. She looked at her palms, then the wet patches all down her back, and then her throat made this strangled sound like a cat hacking up a fur ball. She grabbed a set of wet wipes and started scrubbing herself clean, furiously. Sensing an opportunity to escape, I crawled away like a worm, leaving behind a snail trail of barf. "Get back here," Ruth screamed. She physically couldn't stop scrubbing her hands long enough to come after me. I crawled down the hall, around a bend. At one point, I needed to use the crown of my head to force a door open. The entire time I was coughing and trying to keep that morning's breakfast from creeping up in my throat. Soon, I was conscious enough to realize my left arm was free, whereas the right was pinned against my torso. To my left was the kitchen. Maybe there was a sharp object there I could cut the shrink wrap with. I fumbled towards a central island, crawled up the side, and pulled on a drawer. Cutlery fell all around me with a series of metal clangs, followed by the drawer. My free hand dug through the pile for a knife, finding only spoons. Finally, I grabbed a fork and stabbed at the wrap until my other arm came free. I was like a butterfly emerging from its cocoon. Footsteps came shuffling toward the kitchen. Freeing my legs would take way too long. They still only had a few inches of wiggle room. I would be at Ruth's mercy. Just then something rancid slid up my throat, so I opened my mouth and spat a fat, sticky oyster of what had once been scrambled eggs and bacon, but now looked like an alien life form, into my palm. The beautiful psycho burst through the door. In her hand was a syringe. She launched herself on top of me. My left hand caught her forearm at the last possible second, while the right smeared my biological weapon across her face. As the vomit omelette dripped from her cheek in fat glops, she released the needle and went into furious convulsions. Quickly, I rolled on top of her, grabbed the fallen drawer, and bashed her across the side of the skull. I did this until her eyes rolled back. Then I crawled away on my elbows. In the hall, there was a phone on top of a side table. I punched in 9099. The operator couldn't understand me, but sent a squad car anyway. I remember telling myself to stay awake in case my kidnapper recovered, but here my memory jump cuts to a circle of emergency responders staring down at me. The officers had a hard time believing my story. A concussed Ruth said I went crazy and attacked her. On the way to the station, they took us to the hospital to patch up our cuts and bruises. Everybody seemed to believe I was the aggressor until the police searched the area surrounding the house. In the forest, they spotted a pack of rats scurrying around some bushes, and beneath it there was a body, partially buried, badly decomposed, and wrapped in plastic. A post-mortem confirmed it was the corpse of a local man who disappeared 6 months earlier. I'd seen his mother crying on TV. There were holes in the crotch and left arm of his shrink-wrap prison, where they believed a catheter and IV drip had been inserted so Ruth could keep the poor guy alive, but in a state which prevented him from contaminating her perfect house. Ruth is denying any wrongdoing. Hopefully the prosecutors get their act together soon. although I'm told it could take a year before sentencing. Wheels of justice and all that. I'm still on the road to recovery, mentally speaking. But I'm ready to start looking for love again. Except this time, I'll be careful not to ignore any red flags. When I was 11, I was at the very bottom of my class until the teacher, Miss Henry, made me sit next to the new kid. Thomas and his family moved into town halfway through term, so he just sort of appeared one day. During his second week, Miss Henry tried to draw him out of his shell by asking about his favorite TV program. "What's a TV program?" he replied. That got a laugh. Clearly, he was playing dumb to put one over on her. Everybody thought he'd emerge as the next class clown, but instead he rarely spoke and aced every subject. A few girls tried befriending him. They dug that children of the corn look, I guess, but agreed he was a weirdo after chatting with him in the lunch hall. As desk buddies, he and I locked horns. A lot. Because I was left-handed, our elbows bumped together whenever we wrote, and he got super pissed anytime I asked to borrow a pencil, so I of course did this as often as possible. Anytime I asked Miss Henry to split us up, she'd just sneer and say, "Ryan, there's going to be times in life when you're forced to spend time with people you don't like. Get used to it." One day, as I struggled with a difficult maths exam, Thomas offered to help. I'm guessing he finished early and got bored. It was my first A. Without either of us ever agreeing to it, he started helping me with homework and tough assignments. And soon my grades improved so much, my mom bought me a bunch of Pokemon cards as reward. I offered Thomas some of the one I already owned, but he didn't even know what a Pokemon's was. Then one day, out of the blue, he asked if I'd sleep over at his place. "Father really wants to meet you," he said. Why did his parents even know who I was? We sat together, sure, but he knew so little about pop culture, getting through a conversation was like chewing cult. Still, I wanted to thank him for his help, and my mom didn't raise any objections, so that Friday I packed some clothes and cycled over to his place. I drove down several short roads flanked by woods, past a train station, toward the outskirts of town. Thomas's two-story house sat at the top of a long driveway so steep that I needed to jump off my bike and push most of the way, and all the windows were either boarded up or had the curtains pulled shut. Things got spooky the second I arrived. Thomas and his parents waited patiently to greet me, each grinning like they were on a poster for tooth whitening. Everybody had matching blonde hair and dressed in plain shades of brown, gray, and white. A large man introduced them as the Donovans. My preteen brain categorized him and his wife as old, but in retrospect, there must have been a 20-year age difference there. Mr. Donovan walked my bike into the garage, while me and Thomas followed his mom inside. Something was wrong with the house. It looked too sterile. No clutter, zero toys scattered about. Plus, the antique furniture was older than my grandparents'. In every room, sheets had been draped over objects mounted along the paneled walls, and Mrs. Donovan made a point of telling me that touching the sheets is strictly forbidden. She led us into a sitting room decorated with crucifixes, and more crucifixes, of varying sizes. We kneeled down on a colorful rug, facing each other. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. At last, Mr. Donovan joined our group and led a prayer for the standard stuff: good health, blessed weather. Even though I'd gone to Protestant church with my grandparents, I couldn't figure out what religion we were meant to be practicing. He obviously thought of himself as a spiritual leader and devoted a lot of time to the blind sinners who would suffer swift retribution on Judgment Day. It wasn't until he called for a minute of holy silence that I heard a low, shaken voice. I concentrated hard, tuning out the clock. There were muffled cries. From somewhere within the room, I peeked my left eye open. Nobody was watching, although the way the family didn't stop grinning made me shiver. I glanced around the room. We were alone. When I turned back towards the circle, Thomas's mom was staring straight at me, her smile practically splitting the seams of her face. Quickly, I shut my eyes, already anxious to go home. The silence seemed to last forever. Finally, the spiritual leader clapped his hands and said we should go out back and toss a ball around. On my way out of the room, I listened for more cries, but the sound had died off. I figured my imagination got the better of me. As Thomas and I tossed a leather ball back and forth in the long grass, his dad watched from a crude decking area, beaming. Like at school, Thomas threw with his right hand, whereas I favored my left. We kept trying to pass each other bad shots, competing to make the other miss a catch. It was all in good fun, though. Thomas acted even weirder than at school. Away from his parents, he at least seemed interested in subjects like TV, but now he strictly spoke about Bible stories and recited his favorite verses. I sidestepped his questions my spirituality as much as I could. My arm was aching by the time Mrs. Donovan called us for dinner. In the kitchen, we gathered around the table, and then she brought in a metal pan, presenting 5 boneless chicken breasts lathered in lumpy gravy and canned peaches. Before we ate, everybody linked arms for another prayer, and part of me wished the ritual would never end because then we'd need to choke down the food. A heavy silence fell over the room, then those cries started up again, closer than before. It sounded like a child, and their voice had a panicky quality. If it wasn't for the threat of another glare from Thomas's mom, I would have peeked. As the prayer dragged on, the crying became more hysterical, until finally something rattled against the wall behind me. Mr. Donovan's voice raised, thunderous now, and drowned out the sound. I'm not sure which scared me more, but either way, my arms broke out in goosebumps. The sermon ended 5 minutes later, and we sat there in silence until the head of the table said, "Amen." I checked the corners for sobbing children, finding only more sheets. What then? A CD player? My imagination? The uncooked chicken made me gag. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I picked around the moldy peaches and spread out the plate so it looked like I'd eaten more than I actually had. There was chocolate cake for dessert, but Thomas's mom went around slicing a piece onto each of our plates, which were still covered with chicken and gravy. By that point, my stomach was growling, so I scoffed down a top layer of cake which hadn't touched anything else. I wanted to leave. Faking a bellyache, I asked if they would call my mom and have her come pick me up. Thomas's dad raised an eyebrow. "No need, we have a special remedy." He told the rest of the family to pray for my health and led me out of the room. The front door was on my left, and I briefly considered making a run for it, but the second I did, Mr. Donovan's hand clamped around my shoulder tight. His smile never wavered, but something about his eyes made me break out in goosebumps, like an implied threat. So, I let him guide me into a vintage bathroom. There was a covered cabinet above the sink, and the tub was already full. A thick layer of scud, plus a few dead flies, floated along the surface. Mr. Donovan poured something into the murky water, salt maybe, and ordered me to strip off my t-shirt so I could dip my midsection in. I told him I'd made a miraculous recovery. "Ah, the power of prayer," he said, grinning so wide I could count the back teeth. After that, he announced it was time for bed, despite the fact it wasn't even dark yet. Upstairs at the very far end of the hall, a huge object spanning the width of both walls was covered by another sheet. We got ushered me into Thomas's room, which was even more dull and lifeless than the rest of the house. A queen-sized bed, one small cupboard, and a single wooden chair tucked in the corner. We needed to share the bed, but only after another round of prayer. Then it was lights out before 9 o'clock. Alone with my friend, I rolled over and asked what religion his family practiced anyway. He gave the vaguest answers possible, and when I pushed him, became hyper-defensive. So, I said, "Hey, do you ever want to punch Miss Henry right in her stupid, ugly face?" That made him laugh. Away from his parents, he became more like his school self. Not normal, but closer than before. We argued over who the hottest girl in class was, followed by the most annoying. Without meaning to, I brought up one who always teased him, and it was like all the energy leaked out of my new friend. "I know everybody thinks I'm odd," he sighed. "They just need to get to know you like I did. They'll come around." "You think so?" "Absolutely," he smiled. Then, after a little while, he said, "Hey, want to see something creepy? I'll show you if you think you're brave enough not to wet the bed." I rolled my eyes. He wanted to rattle me, like when we played ball. "Sure, we've got to wait until Mother and Father retire for the night." I kept asking what he had planned, but he wouldn't answer. He got a kick out of keeping me in the dark, I think. He waited until the house fell quiet, and then swung his legs out of bed. This way, in the chilly, dark hall, Enough moonlight shone through the windows beside the staircase to see by. As we tiptoed past several closed doors, that crying returned, growing louder as we approached the object beneath the black sheet. Not my imagination, then. Facing me, Thomas whispered, "Don't worry if he looks at you. Just make sure you look away fast. You'll be fine so long as you look away fast." Before I could ask what that meant, he crouched down, grabbed the corner of the sheet, and pulled it back, revealing an antique armoire. Suddenly, the crying became less muffled. A mirrored panel ran along the bottom section, surrounded by fine gargoyle-like carvings. Still holding the blanket, Thomas pushed his left ear against the carpet and stared at the glass. "He's there. Come look quick. I just wanted to get this over with." I lay down. For a second, I stared at the reflected hall, confused about why we were even there. But then an out-of-place shape caught my eye. I told myself it was my reflection, but then realized I had no reflection. A boy was standing in the corner with his back to us. His shoulders went up and down like he couldn't stop sobbing. "Do you see him?" Thomas asked. I swallowed a gulp, my blood running cold. "Nito, huh?" My brain scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, or a nasty prank. I looked behind me. Nothing, only a bare patch of wall. "He's not there," Thomas said. "Only in the mirror." When I looked back, the boy was much closer and crouched on his side, nose to nose with me. His features were all stretched out, long and narrow like a funhouse mirror, and he had a shock of blonde hair to go with them. His thin lips twisted into a grotesque smile as the boy reached out to me, the tips of his fingers pushing through the glass into reality. I couldn't move a muscle until his face is only inches away from mine, his breath blasting me in the face like a gust of cold air. I scrambled away. If my throat hadn't hitched itself shut, I would have screamed. Quickly, Thomas dropped the sheet and dragged me up by the shoulder, then shoved me down the hall. Behind us, the armoire thrashed from side to side, its hinges squeaking, the boy crying again. Now his voice had an almost hysterical quality. Back in the safety of his room, Thomas pressed his ear against the door until the armoire quietened down. "We are blessed Father didn't hear," he said. "Now we sleep. Father said we aren't to rise before he wakes us to begin the morning ritual." He must not have been the least bit scared by what we saw, because he ushered me into bed and dozed off straight away. But my body wouldn't quit trembling. What was that thing in the mirror? Were there more of them? Is that why they hung sheets everywhere? But why keep any mirrors at all? One thing was for sure. I couldn't spend the night in that house. But Thomas's dad would never let me go. I needed to get the hell out of there without being seen. After Thomas's breathing eased into a rhythm, I swung my legs onto the floor and tiptoed out of the room toward the stairs. But as I approached the top, footsteps came clomping along. I ducked behind the nearest door. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mr. Donovan march past with a rectangular object tucked beneath his arm. There was a tinkling sound from beneath the sheet. He carried it over to Thomas's room, grunting the whole way, and disappeared through the door. My stomach lurched into my throat. I didn't want to find out what he had planned. I flew down the stairs carefully, quietly. I kept my hand against the wall for guidance. The front door was locked. My bike still was in the garage, I hoped, but how did I get there from the landing? Above my head, there were angry shouts of, "He's gone!" No time for plans. I sprinted around the ground floor, flying from room to room. Cries rang out in every one, and now the objects beneath the sheets danced on the walls, bouncing around. The crying child sounded terrified now, like they were in pain. Past the kitchen, there was a cramped utility room with another door. The temperature plummeted as I bolted through it into the garage. The light switch was on the inside wall. I flicked it, then a naked bulb blinked on. Junk was scattered everywhere: car parts, step ladders, boxes of old newspapers, and more sheets thrown over different mirrors, each flapping and twisting. There were more cries, except not just the boy, and for a second, I was afraid to move in her booth. But then a door slammed shut behind me, and I ran for it. My bike was propped up against the wall beside the exit, its handlebars stubbornly tangled with a Christmas tree. After a few tugs, it came loose, and it was like setting off a Rube Goldberg machine. A mop and bucket fell into a stepladder, which clattered to the floor and sent a bag of marbles sprawling across the floor, and so on. I grabbed the bike's handlebars. The exit was one of those old fold-up doors you needed to twist the handle to open. My hands were shaking so badly I needed to set the bike aside and focus solely on this task. The door rotated up. Behind me, Thomas's dad burst into the room, and for the first time he'd stopped smiling. He rushed after me, but struggled to get through the minefield of junk. My bike's rear wheel became tangled with a sheet, and when I started running, it came away like a magician ripping away a tablecloth. I heard the mirror fall to the floor and shatter. Laughter rang out, and when I glanced back over my shoulder, bone-thin arms were reaching out of the glass towards Mr. Donovan. As the garage light rapidly flicked on and off, Mr. Donovan screamed. I will never, as long as I live, forget the terror in that scream. Pure adrenaline got me out of there. Without slowing down, I sprinted to the top of the driveway and leapt onto the bike and flew down the hill. Behind me, screams rang out from deeper in the house. I didn't stop to look back. Mom wasn't pleased about me cycling home so late, but I made up an excuse about Thomas's family getting sick and needing to leave in a hurry, so she let it slide. I knew she'd never believe my story. I tried faking an illness to get out of school because I was so anxious about seeing Thomas again, but she was having none of it. I spent all of Saturday and Sunday wondering about what I'd seen. On Monday, my desk buddy sat without breathing a single word. We never spoke again, and we didn't bump elbows once. To my great relief, Miss Henry announced Thomas's family had moved again the very next day. I never saw him after that, although for a while I had nightmares about his dad dragging me back inside their house, and they tend to flare up anytime I see a mirror-fronted armoire. Can someone please help me understand this? I am trying to make a sense of what he wrote, but I just can't. Through the tears and fear of losing him, I can't understand any of this. I want to go and check for myself what happened, but I am too scared to take our young son with me. Please help. I can feel it preying on me. I can hear it pacing around right outside of my bedroom door. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I have so much to live for. My wife and child are back home. God, I will never be able to see my son grow to teach him baseball or football, to teach him how to drive, and hopefully to make him love cars as much as I do, to see him graduate and become such a talented professional that I know he will be. My dear Angela, I am sorry I won't be there for you. I am sorry I won't be there for you when you need me the most. I promised you that we would be together for eternity, and we will be. I will always be watching over you and Tom. I hope you can somehow feel me and forgive me. Please, love our son for both of us. Move on with your life, find yourself a new partner to cherish happy moments with, someone good for you and Tom, good like I was never able to be. Hopefully you won't forget me, but if you do, that's okay. It won't change my feelings for you. I am sorry I never told you this, but how could I? Would you even be with me if you knew? Would you even believe me? Maybe, I don't know. But that's my burden to carry and mine only. I am a Farmore, and all of the rumors you heard about my family, all of those you shrugged and defended me from those assholes, they are all true. We indeed are one of the wealthiest families around, but that came with a price. Many years ago, my great-grandfather, living in misery and poverty, hunger, his children dying from it, he found a way out of it. In one of his jobs as a gardener, he went to a secluded mansion in the middle of the forest. There, he met someone he called his savior. A couple of months after working there, he struck gold. He never told his family how, but he suddenly became filthy rich. But it changed him. He became a mean, cruel man. He would hire desperate immigrants, those who had no family around here, and would treat them like trash. He would constantly starve them, beat them, torture them. He had his little torture chamber hidden underground of his enormous land. So many people died there in horrific ways. As he grew old, little by little, he wasn't capable of doing such horrific things anymore, and it seemed to affect him. The less of a torturer he could be, the more sick and debilitated he became. He had one son left, the only one who survived the famine and poverty, Jeff. Jeff was the opposite of him. Jeff was kind, worked charity at the church, donated food, and built houses for the poor. He had no idea of what his father was. But after his father's death, Jeff became colder and colder as the days passed. The workers at their farm were relieved when his father died, but it didn't last long. Shortly after, Jeff started giving them less and less food. He started hurting them a little here and there. A punch, a kick, but suddenly the tortures once again resumed. Jeff, my grandfather, had a son, Thomas. My beloved father, Thomas, was nothing like Jeff or my great-grandfather. I grew up on that house with him and Jeff. My mother left us when I was 2 years old. I think I can now understand why. I think you remember, how could you not, what happened last year? My dad, who was caring for my grandfather, killed himself. I couldn't understand why. He was so full of life, so excited to see his grandchildren growing. But he did, and he left Jeff bedbound for me to care for. I never liked the man, but I couldn't leave him to die, so we moved to this godforsaken town so we could live near Jeff. Little by little, I was creeped out more and more by him. He would say odd things like it was my destiny to become it, and that was our family's legacy. I thought he was going insane. One day, I was exploring the vast mansion, and I found my dad's room. It was eerie and creepy to see his photos, our photos, just there, gathering dust. I should have been more present in his life after I left for college and work. There, sitting on his bed, was a weird old book. At first glance, I thought nothing of it, but naturally, I was curious. Once I started reading, I noticed it wasn't a book, but rather a diary, one that belonged to my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather made a deal with something he couldn't even name. It granted us a great fortune in exchange for a vessel. What he didn't know was what that meant. You see, when the vessel grows old and is incapable of causing suffering, it craves for a younger one. That's how Jeff became the monster he was, which I only found out reading this kind of diary. It looks like the creature keeps logs of all of his vessel's life. At least he did on my great-grandfather and Jeff's. On the last few pages, the handwriting was different. I recognized it as my father's. Slowly, he narrated how, after finding that, he would see odd things around the house. A shadow here and there, the book appearing in weird random places, but places where he was. In the kitchen cabinet when he was reaching for some food, on the bathroom sink when he went for a shower, on his closet, his dresser, and on and on. He would hear random sounds at night outside of his room, like someone was impatiently pacing right outside of his bed. It tried to open the door every night, but it was locked. The thing would never say anything, just pace around, but he knew what he wanted. That's why my dad killed himself, to end the curse. But it didn't end, it just delayed it. Right now I can hear it pacing around, violently shaking the knob, pounding at the door. It must be very close to death. Jeff's death, and it needs my body, my mind, my vessel. But it didn't end, it just delayed it. Right now, I can hear it pacing around, violently shaking the knob, pounding at the door. It must be very close to death. Jeff's death, and it needs my body, my mind, my vessel. But I know how to end this, at least I hope so, for the sake of our son. During the day, I soaked the whole house in gasoline. I locked my room and waited for the thing to come out. I know it can sense what I am about to do, and that must be why it is also impatient and, dare I say, desperate. This is my last email to you, Angela. Please remember me not as a freak, but rather as your loving husband. Tell our best memories to our son so he can grow up knowing the best part of me. That's all I ask. I love you both.